the general description of the project that we did has to do with well-being and virtue. One other thing I learned about data collection and science is if you're doing a longitudinal project, which we are, we have 4 waves of data collection, and at this point I believe we just finished collecting the 3rd wave, so the 4th is yet to come. And if you want to track character change and how it relates to personal projects over time, that's going to take a long time. So after 1 year, we don't have anything to say about character change. So we decided to look at something else that the data can help us with, and that's why today we're going to focus on the concept of well-being and well-being research. But I did want to say, just so that you have some idea, and I think Colin, again, will say more about this at the end, we did apply for another grant to be able to extend the data collection for another couple of years, which would be nice, because I think character change is going to really be a long-term, the longer we can follow our participants, I think the better off we'll be. And Colin and I have another grant working with another psychologist at Minnesota, Bob Kruger, which is a, what's that project called? Behavioral Genetics and Human Agency, which there are some connections between this project and that project, and we've hired a postdoc who might also work again on the data that we've collected for this project. So again, that spirit of collaboration where you find new young people and let them use the resources that you were able to acquire. Anyway, so that's just by way of background. So now on to the subject of today. You can read my. It's kind of funny, don't you think? It took me like 20 minutes to make this slide. That's John Stuart Mill, in case you don't know. I think, so I'm mainly, most of my research lately is on well-being, and I think it would be great if John Stuart Mill and Ed Diener could talk to each other. That would be a really nice thing. Why would that be a nice thing? Well, both I think about well-being and also about virtue, though the work we're going to present right now is just about well-being. But I think on both topics, philosophers have good theories and most of us a knowledge of 2,000 years of the history of thinking about these concepts and how to think about them rigorously and systematically. But a lot of our theories make empirical assumptions, as we just saw with starting with Adam Smith, you get an empirical assumption that you can then test. Psychologists and then philosophers don't really have the expertise to test those assumptions on their own. Psychologists have great expertise in measurement, but sometimes the questions like what you should study in the first place, what is well-being, what should you attempt to operationalize and measure, those are philosophical questions and not psychological questions. So that's, and Will is up here to represent philosophical sophistication in psychological research and someone who consults with philosophers to start with informed views about what ought to be measured. So everyone, I think, is on board that this would be a good idea. So when it comes to well-being in particular, what's the problem? Why would it be good to have more interdisciplinary interaction? And really, in particular, what we're talking about is why would it be helpful to have measures of well-being that are not the standard measures that psychologists tend to use? So the predominant view in psychology is that well-being is life satisfaction or affect balance. There are certainly psychologists who have other views, but that's the predominant picture. Even when eudaimonic measures are used in psychology, those measures are most of them, not all, but most of them are measures of how people feel about how their lives are going. So they might not be hedonic, and so they're not measuring whether people feel pleased or displeased, but they are measuring whether people feel that their lives are meaningful or feel that they have purpose in their lives. So that's the short version. When it comes to philosophers, this is a kind of, most people talking about well-being, if they want to introduce the subject, will start with this tripartite division that Parfit came up with. It doesn't quite fit the current landscape perfectly, but it's not a bad place to start. So in philosophy, you have objective theories, and those you can divide into two different types. Objective list theories that just take well-being to be getting, you have well-being if you get the objective goods. So the objective goods are typically things like knowledge, pleasure, friendship, virtue. If you as an individual possess those goods, then those are good for you, and that's the equivalent to well-being. Well-being is identified as the good for. So objective list theories really are just lists. Eudaimonic theories, or eudaimonism in philosophy, and this is a vexed term, so if you're a philosopher and you're cranky about my use of it here, we can talk about that later. But for the most part, eudaimonic theories in philosophy are Aristotelian nature fulfillment theories, where what's good for you is fulfilling your nature as a human being, as a member of the human species. And that's not a matter of what's in your head, because you can be experiencing a lot of pleasure and happy feelings and nevertheless not be living up to your full potential as a human being. Desire satisfaction theories are they're really popular in philosophy right now, and they're absolutely dominant in economics. The basic idea is that what's good for you is getting what you want. That sounds terrible to most psychologists, I think, which is why there's no equivalent to preference satisfactionism in psychology. And philosophers have modified, most philosophers don't literally think that simply getting what you want right now at this moment is what's good for you and definitive of your well-being. So there are some variations here. The main kind of variation that preference satisfaction theories take is that they say that the kinds of preferences or desires that should be satisfied for you to constitute well-being are in some way idealized, so they're informed preferences or autonomous preferences or something like that. Value fulfillment theories, which is the kind of theory that I defend, are similar to desire satisfaction theories in that they do make the fulfillment of the agent's own goals to be what defines her welfare. And then there are hedonistic theories in philosophy, which are probably the closest, you get the closest with hedonism to something that psychologists take to be well-being. But even when it comes to hedonism among philosophers, they don't just think that any old pleasure will do. Well, some of them do, but many, like John Stuart Mill, thought there are higher quality pleasures that engage your higher human capacities, and those are the pleasures that contribute more to your well-being than the low quality pleasures that you share with the beasts. There's Fred Feldman, who proposes that what counts for well-being, it's not clear he really endorses this, but he offers it as an option. What counts as well-being is truth-adjusted pleasures. So if the pleasure you're having is based on a delusion, that pleasure doesn't actually count for well-being. So the upshot here is that most philosophers, really the vast majority, although there are more hedonists born every day, I find, but really the majority of philosophers don't think that well-being is all about your own experience. Rather, they think, most do think that your own experience is important, but it has to be connected in the right way to the world. So maybe by the little bit that I said about what philosophers' theories of well-being are like, or maybe you've heard me talk about this before, like for instance last year, you can tell that philosophical theories are not that easy to test directly. I mean, if you just take, for an example, well, truth-adjusted pleasures. So what are you going to ask people? Is your pleasure based on a delusion? Or yeah, that's not helpful. And idealized desire satisfaction theories, how are you going to find out what a person would want for themselves if they were fully informed about their circumstances? These are not easy things to test. So our thought, we were already committed to using, for various reasons, this personal projects analysis, which I think Colin's going to tell you a little bit more about. And in working through, looking at the data and thinking about the project, we realized that there's something nice about personal projects analysis in terms of well-being, which is not necessarily that satisfaction or achievement of your personal projects is what's good for you, but that anyone with any theory can agree that satisfaction of at least a subset of a person's personal projects is good for them. So it's, thinking of it as an ecumenical approach where you don't have to decide which theory is correct, but we're thinking that anyone from a variety of different theoretical perspectives, if you used personal projects analysis as a measure, would be able to look at the data and find something that's of interest to them. Because people have personal projects that line up with lists of objective goods. They have personal projects that line up with the kinds of nature fulfillment goals that Aristotle thought we have. Desire satisfactionism lines up with personal projects analysis quite naturally. So we won't all agree on the explanation for why success in a particular project is good for a person. Different theories will explain that in different ways. And different theorists will have different constraints on which personal projects could actually contribute to your welfare. So if you have somebody whose personal projects are, vicious, like I want to rule the world, I want to exterminate, I don't know what, something good, then somebody like Aristotle or an objective list theorist would want to say, well, we don't care about those personal projects, but they could look at the kinds of personal projects that do appear on their lists. So that's the thought. And now I will turn things over to Colin. You want me to go backwards?
Yeah, I think I added that last bullet to
okay.
surreptitiously. All right. It's funny, I thought that we were including personal projects analysis because you were already committed to the importance of personal projects in your theory.
Yeah, I was trying to hide that because that seems...
Oops, sorry. You want to hand off the clicker?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. All right, so we have this idea that personal projects are a really useful potential method to study well-being empirically from a broader set of perspectives than what's typical in psychology, and especially from these various philosophical perspectives. And what I'm going to talk about today in terms of our empirical work is really just sort of a first step with these data, right? As I think you probably got the idea from Valerie that this is a large and complex data set. It's still being collected even. There's another wave that's going to happen in the fall. So our first step here is just to ask, is a personal projects approach empirically commensurable with traditional psychological approaches to well-being? And so we're saying that this approach is valuable largely because of the way it makes contact with various philosophical theories of well-being, but we don't want to just alienate and abandon the psychologists, right? It would be nice if we could show that this approach also is commensurable with traditional psychological approaches to well-being, which are subjective. So our hypothesis that I'm going to show you some data relevant to now is that success in personal projects will predict various forms of subjective well-being, even after controlling for past success and past well-being. And that last part is really important, and it's what makes the fact that we have a longitudinal design so useful here. And that is that we know, especially about well-being, that there is a strong trait-like component to it. People who are happy now will tend to be happy in a year, will tend to be happy in 5 years. A lot of the variance in these subjective well-being measures can be predicted by traditional measures of personality traits. So in essence, well-being itself is a trait. But of course, it does fluctuate over time. It is responsive to our life situation. And we want to be able to separate out that part of people's well-being that is simply due to their general tendency toward happiness from the part that is responsive to aspects of their lives, such as their success in personal projects. And we can do that statistically by employing a longitudinal design. So to talk about the methods for our study, what I'm going to be showing you from is data from 196 students. They're not first-year undergraduates now, they're second-year undergraduates. But we started in our first wave with 250 participants who were first-year undergraduates. And we're tracking them over a period of 2 years. If we do indeed get another grant to keep tracking them for 2 more years, we'll basically have covered their entire undergraduate career. What we have here is data from people who we were able to get back again for the second wave of data. So we know obviously we're going to lose some people at each wave. So these were assessed at 2 different time points. One was the spring semester of 2016, and one was the fall semester of 2016. So there's a summer in between there. We just finished collecting the spring semester of 2017, and there will be one more. So these people did a lot of assessments in the lab. Today, I'm only going to be talking about 2 of the assessments, and one of them is a whole bunch of different subjective well-being scales. So we have the satisfaction with life scale. We have some of the most commonly used measures of positive and negative emotion, negative affect. We have a flourishing scale, which is designed to tap into how well people are doing in a variety of important domains. Is sort of based on the kind of Aristotelian, more eudaimonic, or perhaps even list theories. I don't remember exactly how they justify this, but how are you doing in your relationships? How are you doing in your work? How are you doing in various ways? There's a purpose in life scale and a meaning in life scale. Again, we wanted to go beyond just the most common way of approaching this subjectively, which is in terms of satisfaction and affect balance, to also think about these things that psychologists think of as measuring eudaimonia, and then philosophers get annoyed when they say that they're measuring eudaimonia. But at any rate, this is sort of covering the range of things that psychologists use to assess well-being, but notice that they're all subjectively assessed. And I'll just say that in addition to these measures, these questionnaire measures, we have questionnaire measures of standard personality models, virtuous personality traits or character models. And so we're going to be tracking all of these things as they develop over time. We can look at all of them in terms of the way in which they predict people's success in personal projects, or their choice of personal projects, or their trajectories over time in terms of what projects they're pursuing. But again, today, just focusing on a relatively simple aspect of this. So we're using Brian Little's personal projects analysis. I really like this method, partly because it is idiographic at the same time that it allows you to do standardized assessment. So first, what you do is that you have people generate a list of their personal projects. And this is the text that we use to explain what is going on here. We're interested in studying the kinds of activities and concerns that people have over the course of their lives. We call these personal projects. All of us have a number of personal projects at any given time that we think about, plan for, carry out, and sometimes, though not always, complete. Some projects may be focused on achievement, getting my degree, others on the process, enjoying a night out with friends. They may be things we choose to do or things we have to do. They may be things we are working towards or things we are trying to avoid. Projects may be related to any aspect of your daily life, university, work, home, leisure, and community, among others. Please think of projects in this broad way. Right, so we really are tapping into people's goals in a very broad sense. What is it that people are doing in their lives? And then we narrow it down in step 2 a little bit. So they generate about 15 projects, and then we tell them to choose the 10 that are most important to understanding them as people. So the rest of the assessment is based on this list of, this idiosyncratic list for each participant of 10 projects. And then those get piped forward in the questionnaire process. This is all computerized questionnaires. And we have them rate their projects on a whole variety of different Likert scale rating systems. Things like how central is this to your identity? How important is it to you? How anxious does this project make you? Have a whole bunch of emotions that might be related to projects. I'm not going to talk about any of those today. I'm just going to focus on this one question, which is how successful have you been in this project so far? So that's one of the things that they get asked. And they simply rank that on a scale from very unsuccessful to very successful. And so we're thinking about this as our measurement of people's current project success. They've got a current list of projects. How well do they feel like they're doing in them? All right, so that's one of our important measures here today. That's their current success in their current projects. There's another item that they filled out that is not a typical Likert scale, but it is they are picking what stage they are at in each one of their projects. And the stages are awareness, planning, action, and completion. Plus, there was described a transition between each one, so you could get a little bit more fine-grained. Like if you feel like you're somewhere in the transition between awareness and planning, there would be an option you could pick there. So this ends up with a 7-point scale, basically, of your project stages. And now, one thing that we did was that when they came in to do their assessments at the second time, they sit down and they just generate a whole new list of projects, right? Whatever their current personal projects are, those may have changed a bunch over 6 to 9 months. But at the end of the second wave of assessment, we also pulled up the list of projects that they had generated in the first wave. And we asked them to, again, say what stage of that project they were at. And we did this as a way to get at how successful people had been in their past set of personal projects. So at time 2, we've also got these stage ratings, not only for the time 2 projects, but also for the time 1 projects. Okay, so we thought about this as a way to distinguish between how people are doing in their current projects right now and how they are doing in their projects at the previous wave. And I think actually doing this empirical analysis and writing this paper has led us to think about how we're going to change some of this assessment in our final wave of data collection. So I don't think that what we've got here is perfect, but we developed 3 different ways to potentially assess success in the past projects. One is just look at the number of projects that have been completed at time 2, right? So the time 1 projects, you say, this one's done, right? So that's one index of project success. Another is to think about progress, right? So some of these projects are potentially ongoing, long-term, but we might still be able to think about how far people have come in them. So we can basically just take the stage that they're at time 2 and subtract the stage that they're at time 1 to get a numerical index of progress. Then we thought, okay, well, maybe there are certain types of progress that are more important than others as people are engaging in these projects. Right, so you notice that there's awareness and planning. You still haven't actually gotten going on the project yet in terms of carrying it out. So we thought, well, it's obviously important if you get to the end of a project, but maybe there's a really important stage moving from something that is pre-action to action. You've actually set it in motion. So we developed yet a 3rd index of past project success where we gave people a point for completion, but we also gave people a point if they, at time 2, had at time 1 been in the awareness or planning stage and had moved into action or beyond at time 2. So we have 3 different ways, and this was kind of experimental because we weren't sure exactly what the best way to approach this was. Okay, so for both of these indices, we aggregated across the 10 projects, right? So we've got people's average success across the 10 projects currently, and then with these different past success ratings, we've also got their average across the 10 projects, and that's what we're going to be analyzing here. All right, so here's the most basic set of results, which is just to look at correlations. And what you can see here right away is something kind of interesting, which is that people's current assessment of their project success, and this is collapsing across the 2 waves, just averaging the correlation that we got, because we could do the current success at wave 1 and at wave 2. Past success we can only do at wave 2, obviously. what we see in that top line are the average wave 1 and wave 2 associations with current success, and you can see that that's consistently related to project success. Satisfaction with life, positive affect, negative affect, flourishing, purpose in life, meaning in life. Something I didn't explain about the meaning in life questionnaire, it actually has 2 subscales. One of them is the presence of meaning in your life, which is a sort of typical way of people might think about well-being. The other one is whether you're searching for meaning. And I don't think that's really, at face value, what we think about as well-being at all, right? You may be searching for meaning in your life precisely because you don't have it, precisely because you were feeling relatively lacking in well-being. But I included it up here just because I thought, we measured it, and why not? And indeed, you can see that your search for meaning is not correlated with your current project success, but the presence of meaning in your life, subjectively reported, is. But look at what we see basically for the past success is that there's no association with present well-being at all at time 2, right? So this is time 2 well-being, and then how far you've come, how much success you've had with your time 1 projects at time 2. No associations whatsoever. So that was a little bit surprising to us. We thought that there would probably be some link between these things that you had said were important to you, 6 to 9 months ago, previous semester, summer's gone by. Apparently, you've just forgotten everything you cared about over the summer. Now you've got a new set of projects. Those matter to you, your success, and those matter to you, and how far things have come with the other projects are just irrelevant. Okay, so that was interesting. But then we had a kind of worrisome thought, and this is where the longitudinal analysis comes in. What if even that first row of associations isn't real, right? Because what if that just reflects the fact that people who tend to be positive about their life also tend to be optimistic about how well they're doing in their projects, and if we had some more objective way of assessing this, we would see that there's just nothing there either. And so that's where it becomes really important to think about, is there a link between your success in your current projects and your current well-being, controlling for your general tendency to say that you're successful in your projects and your general tendency to experience a lot of well-being. And so for that, we moved to these cross-lagged longitudinal design. So this is a path model. I should have thrown it up here without the numbers on it first and explained it and then put the numbers up, but what the heck, I didn't. So what we've got here is on the left, we've got time 1, and on the right, we've got time 2. And so notice that as we continue this study and as we analyze the 3rd wave of data and collect the 4th wave of data, we'll be able to extend this out in time, and we can get to doing more sophisticated analyses with more sophisticated longitudinal designs. This is kind of the most basic longitudinal design you can do with 2 different measures. So we've got time 1 on the left, time 2 on the right, and we've got our measure. In this case, it's the satisfaction with life scale. I'm going to go through all of the different well-being measures and show you how this turns out. We've got, those first 2 measures are correlated, and then we have satisfaction with life predicts satisfaction with life later on. And you can see that's a pretty strong association, right? 0.64 there up on the top line. So there's a lot of stability there, and we know that. That's not news to personality psychologists. We know that well-being behaves like a trait. Something that we didn't know, but we see, perhaps not surprisingly, is that to a slightly lesser degree, how well people are doing with their projects, even though this is an idiosyncratic list of projects that people generate, and they generate a whole new list at time 2. Something we haven't done yet is quantified how many exact repeats there are of projects from time 1 to time 2. So that'll be something important for us to delve into going forward. But so even considering that, there is this persistence in how well people feel that they're doing in their projects over time. So there's a large amount of stability there. So that makes this longitudinal analysis really important. And so the one that we should be focusing on here is this. So we're interested in, does your current project success predict your current satisfaction with life or other types of well-being, as I'll show you in a minute, even controlling for your previous well-being and controlling for your previous success in projects at the previous wave. And what you can see here after that setup is that, yes, indeed, there is a significant prediction of your satisfaction with life from your current project success, even controlling for those past measurements. So that suggests that there is this temporally contingent way in which doing well in your projects currently is linked to your feelings of well-being currently, independently of how you more generally or in the past have experienced well-being and been optimistic about your success. Now, Here is the one of these measures where we do not see an effect. This is positive affect. So positive affect, with all of these, you're going to see that there is this strong, stable dynamic where the various measures of well-being are reasonably stable over time. And in this case, positive affect is not predicted from current project success at time 2. And I think that this is potentially sensible if we think about the link between positive affect and the kind of optimism that's involved when people say, I'm doing well in my projects. Right? That is the thing that seems potentially most directly conceptually linked at a trait level, that people who are naturally experience a lot of positive affect tend to be sort of, energized and excited about their lives, are going to be the ones who are likely to say, yes, I'm doing great in my projects, regardless of how true that is objectively. So that's my little post hoc explanation for why we don't see a significant effect there, or why it's a little bit less than the others. But what I can tell you is that with all of the other types of well-being, we do see this predicted effect. So here is negative affect. I think this might even have been the strongest one. Current project success is predicting negative affect, even controlling for past negative affect, and even controlling for past project success. Here's the flourishing scale. Once again, flourishing, your sense of flourishing in various domains of your life was, I think, in our data, the most stable thing over time, which is kind of interesting. But again, we see a significant effect over here. Current success predicting flourishing, predicts purpose in life, predicts your sense of the presence of meaning in your life. Oh, I guess this one, that's actually just as stable as flourishing. And then, again, just for completeness, I'll throw in this other scale. And here's a surprise. Your sense of searching for meaning in life was actually positively predicted by your success in your current projects, controlling for your past sense of meaning in life and your past project success. I don't know what that significant effect means. We just investigated it out of curiosity, even though we don't think of searching for meaning as really a typical well-being measure. You can tell me what you think, potentially. All right, so what can we conclude from this relatively early attempt at getting into these data? So first of all, success in current personal projects was associated with subjective well-being in a temporally contingent manner. So I think that's important. I think that says that we can proceed with thinking about well-being in terms of these personal projects in a way that psychologists can relate to based on the way that they've typically thought about well-being. Perhaps more interestingly was our null result, which was that success in previous personal projects did not show any association with these subjective measures of well-being. So we thought about why not, why that might be, and we come up with a number of possible explanations. First, maybe these projects just aren't important enough, right? If your past projects are just not really particularly important, then maybe they're not going to have any kind of carrying on effect on your well-being or relation to your well-being. And yet, when we look at the ratings of importance, because one of the things that we asked about was how important these projects are to you, there's an average rating of 4.34 out of 5, and it's a 6-point scale starting at 0. So, and not only that, but we told them right at the beginning to come up with things that were important to you, and then to weed down from 15 to 10 that were the most important. So that's probably not the most likely explanation. Although one thing we're going to do in the future is actually get into multi-level analysis, where we can look at individual projects nested within people, so that we can look at things like whether the importance of specific projects to specific people moderates some of the effects that we care about. And on their face, a lot of these projects seem important, right? Become a doctor, be good to my girlfriend, stop smoking weed, start applying church lessons to my everyday life. This is just sort of a sampling of some of the projects that we got. People are listing, and some of them, one was like get a new nose ring. I mean, sometimes some of the projects do not seem very important, right? But a lot of them really did. So possibly a likely reason, and I think Valerie already alluded to this, is that maybe we're just not waiting long enough to see the impact of these projects, right? So there's a connection between how you feel about the things that you're really currently actively engaged in and your current sense of well-being. Okay, sure. But if we really want to see how the success on those things over the long term has an impact on your well-being, maybe we really have to wait longer. Some of these projects are related to things like finding a good relationship and getting married. And remember, these are college students, and first-year college students at that. And some of them are related to getting a career that they find satisfactory. So these are important things that they're going to be working on and keep working on, but they probably aren't assuming that they're already going to be done or that a lot of progress is already going to be made. So maybe their progress in those at this point in life is just not going to be relevant. Maybe if we assess them, if we get this other grant and we follow them all 4 years, or even if we follow them up some years after they've graduated, maybe then we'll see that the success in some of the projects, the important projects that they cared about even when they were freshmen, will actually predict their well-being. But it could be just a matter of the time scale for these things to play out. Another possibility is that there is a genuine change in their projects, right? So maybe they really did abandon some of those projects. They don't care about them anymore. One of the things that we're gonna do in our final wave of data collection is go back and have them not just rate what stage of each project that they're at from their previous waves, but actually how important is this project to you now? Do you still care about this project? So we're gonna try to delve into some of the potential reasons for this lack of association. And then another and possibly interesting issue here is that maybe this measure of past success that we're using, getting people to say what stage of a project that they're at, really taps more into the kind of objective status of these projects, whereas your current sense of how successful you are in your project is really more of a subjective kind of an assessment. And maybe subjective well-being of the sort that we were assessing from the psychologist's arsenal is really linked only to people's more subjective evaluations of progress. That would be a kind of interesting way in which the more objectively oriented philosophical approaches to well-being doesn't connect with psychological approaches to well-being that are more subjectively oriented. So that's one possibility, and we want to follow up with that a bit too. If that is true, if the current measure of current project success is more subjective, and the measures of past success that we were looking at is more objective, I think that's another good reason to use personal projects assessment to study well-being, because it means it makes contact both with subjective theories of well-being and with objective theories of well-being empirically. Okay, so I just said that essentially. We can make contact empirically with traditional psychological approaches to well-being, and we also have, I think, greater potential to be useful for a variety of other philosophical approaches. We're probably basically out of time, but maybe I'll just very quickly mention, just because as Valerie, I really liked the way that you set that up. I don't think we planned that. That was just all spontaneous. But I too appreciate the way in which psychology as a discipline really is collaborative and especially is generative in the sense of nurturing future generations. And so I just wanted to mention our graduate student, or specifically Moin Syed's graduate student, Sarah Nelson, who's doing her dissertation working on contextual identity integration. One of the sets of questionnaires that we included in this study are questionnaires about identity, identity confusion, identity consolidation, search for identity. This is Moin's, one of his primary areas of research. And in the identity world, they talk a lot about this idea of contextual identity integration, which is the ability for your various parts of your identity related to work, related to relationships, to actually be coherent and not in conflict with each other. And we can get at that in a way that people have not before with people's specific personal projects, because one of the things that we do with these projects is that we have people, in addition to filling out a bunch of Likert scales, they also go through for each project and indicate whether it is facilitating their progress in each other project, hindering their progress in each other project, or irrelevant to their progress in each other project. So we get this matrix of each project against each other project and how they interact with each other and how they conflict or help each other. So she's going to be using that data to try to study this idea of the importance of identity integration across different areas of our lives. All right, thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I think that's a really exciting project. And I love the idea of the personal projects kind of driving consistency across time. But I noticed that, in your explanations for the fact that it doesn't, past success isn't predicting kind of your current well-being. I noticed all your explanations were related to projects, but I wonder if there's a more general explanation, like the hedonic treadmill, that people really just adapt to the good things in life over time, and regardless of whether it's your project or just other good things that happen to you, you kind of forget about it and move on.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that would be perfectly consistent with the fact that we did find a link between your present project success and well-being.
Right.
Because you may be pushed around temporarily and just sort of end up back at your general, set point, as they say. I mean, I think we know at this point that set points are not permanently set. Set points themselves shift over time, at least slightly. But nonetheless, yeah, I think that's very plausible, right? There is this strong trait-like component to well-being. And I think it's important if how our lives are going currently actually has an impact on our current well-being. But at the same time, maybe, well, I guess encouraging for some and depressing for others, that no matter how that's going now, in a year from now, you'll likely be near that level with various deviations due to whatever is going on at that current moment in your life.
Do you have any measures of other things that are affecting people's well-being at a given session than personal projects?
Well, all sorts of personality measures.
But those are intended as, sort of general personality measures. They're not specifically asking about what's going on now. So actually one of the things that we're planning to add to our fourth wave of data collection in preparation, in anticipation of hopefully getting this additional grant to carry on the study for longer, but will still be useful even potentially with that one wave, is an assessment of life stressors. So yeah, we realize that would have been great if we had done that. We didn't do it, but we're going to add it.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll move on so other people can talk.
Thanks so much. What an interesting presentation from both of you. I'm interested in this project sort of mentality, so I want to talk about my sister. She is a project manager at a large architectural firm. She's 60 now. And her life is projects. Her raising her kids was a project. Everything is a project. That's just the way she is. But at this point, we have a mother with Alzheimer's. She takes care of her for 6 months. I take care of her 6 months. I do much better and am much happier doing this than my sister because she does not see an outcome. She's putting all this effort into caring for my mother, but she's getting worse. And this is very, very hard for her. So I was interested, first of all, you're taking the college years where people still have their whole future in front of them, and all projects have a potential good end if they've picked it. And then you've got someone in their 60s who's looking back, and we've been interviewing a lot of people in their 60s for our project. And at that point, it's not clear people are as project-oriented, for one thing, in their 60s. And then you often have had something like this where you're taking care of aging parents or disabled children or something where it's not a project with a positive outcome. So that's harder for people that are project-oriented in my experience with my sister. So I just wondered if you could comment on both the age factor of 60s versus college years and people that are project-oriented that have quote-unquote projects that aren't going to have good outcomes.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question, Peggy. And so Colin's right that the reason, I sort of forgot this, that the reason we were drawn to the personal projects analysis in the first place is because of how well it fits with my own value fulfillment work on well-being. But for me, value fulfillment, there's a kind of important difference between what I think it means to fulfill your values and what it is to have a project and succeed in terms of that project. So what I actually think about well-being is that there are values we have where fulfilling them doesn't mean achieving a goal. It means developing and maintaining a certain set of dispositions to respond emotionally to a loved one in a certain way and engage in certain kinds of activities and behaviors. So philosophically, that's my answer. I'm trying to think whether we have, so I guess I don't know whether the participants think of projects in a definite goal-oriented way, but of course when we ask them that, about their stage of success, we're imposing that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And I think I showed you the description that we give to participants of personal projects, and one of the things it says explicitly is that these may be more achievement-oriented or they may be more process-oriented. So we give them an example of something that's has a concrete achieved outcome, but also something that just might be sort of part of the process of enjoying life, like, you know, having people sometimes put projects down like, you know, be a good friend, or throw a good party next weekend, right? I mean, so sometimes these things are more oriented toward the process and toward that experience. And so we're not limiting them in that way. You know, I guess people may just hear that word project and project certain assumptions onto it. I think of it in a much more general sense, and that's partly because the other reason that we used personal projects assessment is that my theory of personality and behavior that I'm working on is a cybernetic theory, and I talked about this a year ago at this conference, so people may have a vague, hazy recollection of that. But so it's very focused on the fact that all human behavior and experience is goal-directed. Even if those aren't goals in the sense that psychologists sometimes think of as like these very concrete representations that people are committed to, I think that the best way to understand human experience and information processing is in terms of the way in which at every moment we are thinking about like what we want the future to be. And that is always guiding our actions. And that extends from this very immediate future even to much more distant futures. So one of the things I like about personal projects analysis is that it kind of allows for those differences in timescales. Some people write down these like lifelong projects about their careers or their character or whatever, and some people write down these very much more immediate projects. And so I think that there is room for both of those kinds of ways of thinking about projects within the paradigm.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree that there is room, but I think it would be really interesting to see if you switch by the time you're 60 to more process-oriented.
I mean, so we're studying undergraduates not just because they're a convenient and captive audience, but also because we're really interested in getting at a stage where people are going through a lot of change in identity and a lot of, they're really formulating what it means to be a human being and a good human being. And so they're thinking about what are the right projects to be working on, and maybe they're just thinking about when they're going to get drunk on Friday, but I think that there's a lot of potential for personality development and character development in that age range. And since we are trying to look at how these things shift longitudinally over several years, that was part of our rationale. But I would love to see somebody do in-depth personal projects analysis with people later in life. I think that would be great.
Firstly, thank you for a very wonderful presentation. My question was, I was wondering if you've had a chance to look at the literature and research on personal strivings. The prompt that you have seems very similar to the work on personal strivings. This is Bob Emmons' work that comes out of UC Davis, and some of their focus, and actually a really good resource is his book, The Psychology of Ultimate Concerns. And the focus of this work looks at what people are striving to do. So they're goal strivings,
Yeah.
and they're very similar to projects. Yeah. And I see a distinct contribution here, which looks at actually the completion of those projects and the whole process. But in terms of strivings, there might be some really interesting things you could look at, especially in terms of whether people are doing this because they're autonomously driven, or whether they're intrinsically driven, or because they feel that they ought to do it, and
Yeah.
that could change.
I think that that's one of the,
this.
if I'm recalling correctly, I think that that's one of the things that we asked. So there's a whole standard set of questions that came from Little's work on this technique, and then we added a couple more that we were interested in. And I think that asking about whether you're doing this because you feel like it's an obligation or that you ought to do it, or how much, and there's certainly questions about how much this is reflecting like who you really are. It's like a sort of a trademark of yourself and your identity. There are questions like that in there, so we will be able to get at that. But I wasn't familiar with Emmons' work, and so thanks very much for pointing that out, because it sounds like I should be.
Yeah, it's an interesting body of work, and at this point they have quite a few studies on this, and some of the, at and they have a fairly well-developed protocol that I think might be interesting to look at, because they have aspects such as how hard is it to do this? So how hard is that goal that you have?
We ask that.
Yeah, and the importance question, and the identity piece. So there are quite a lot of aspects to this, including what is your expectation for how much happiness this is going to bring to you? So kind of whether you're already setting a high bar, and then later whether that ends up actually fulfilling it or not. So that might be an interesting piece to kind of look at.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, very interesting project. It's I'm particularly happy about the longitudinal nature of it, that you're looking at this over time. So I want to go back to what Peggy brought up, because I think the Little's matrix is really good for this. As I recall, he has measures that he calls integrity measures and measures he calls efficacy measures. So it can help you to sort out whether people are pursuing these goals with the idea of an outcome or with the idea of a process or a kind of way of being.
Yeah.
And so it's two very different things. And so we've done several studies on goal pursuit. So you got personal projects, strivings, and goal pursuit,
Yep.
which are, I think, pretty much all family resemblances.
I would think of those all as fundamentally
Yeah.
the same thing.
Yeah, I don't think that there's all that much difference. Our prompt is not that different from yours. And what we did find that people who pursued things with an outcome orientation tended to have, that tended to be related to more hedonic well-being. And then people who pursued more way of being kind of goals tended to be, they had more eudaimonic well-being. And that these paths were pretty independent. We didn't expect them to be independent like they were. And we found this in about 3 or 4 studies.
Yeah, that's interesting, especially because the hedonic and eudaimonic questionnaire measures of well-being are pretty highly correlated, right? So it's interesting when you can dissociate them in those ways.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, so we did get a high covariance
Yeah.
there between those
Yeah.
two in the models. The other thing I wanted to just touch base with you about is I was very happy to see that you were going to be asking people, or have been asking people, about whether they've made genuine changes in their projects. Because I don't know about you, but I had some misspent time in my youth, and there's a callousness there, and, you know, a little bit of inconsistency. But also, in working with undergraduates, I think one of the things that most of us see is sometimes they make really good choices about abandoning projects. I want to become a doctor. I find out that's not in me.
Right.
Or I want to be good to this girlfriend. The reason I'm not good to this girlfriend is that we're not good together. And so abandoning that relationship is a really good idea. Or, you know, and on and on. So I think there's a self-discovery process, particularly in this emerging adult time. And the way people think about that a lot is about exploration, and part of the goal is to sort your goals and get rid of some of them and to take some new ones on and so forth. So I would really encourage you to go into as much depth as you have room for that, to give people a chance to tell you maybe a little bit about why they might have abandoned a goal. Was it a good idea? Are they happy about that? Are they unhappy about that? You know, it was my dad's goal. I don't want to do it anymore because that's his goal. I want my goal. You know, things like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, and I think beginning to work with these data has really led us to think about adding exactly that kind of assessment to the final and hopefully not final wave if we get another grant. There is a whole module of the assessment that I didn't talk about, in which we have more qualitative data that's like that, in which we ask, first we ask, like, what are the various strategies that you're using to pursue this goal? And so people can list, you know, what the things how they're pursuing a goal. But we also ask them, why are you pursuing this goal? And so that goes up a level, and then we ask, well, so why are you doing that? And we actually basically make them go up and up until they get to something that they say, this is a terminal goal, right? There's no higher reason, this is the top. So hopefully we can get at some of that in that way with the current projects, and then I think if we do something similar to what you're saying about people's previous projects from previous waves, we can get a really nice picture about why people are doing things and then how that shifts over time.
Those hierarchical data are really distressing for a philosopher because you think it's the simplest. You teach your undergrads, and like if you teach intro to ethics, you teach them the difference between instrumental goods and ultimate goods, or instrumental and intrinsic, or however you say it. They don't seem to understand that distinction, half of them. They're just sort of writing things that are vaguely associated.
Right, so I'm making this sound good, but when you actually look at the data, undergraduates attempt to say why they're doing things, a lot of it's just garbage.
Yeah.
So they may not even have a constitutive type goal, but they phrase it in instrumental terms all the time. It's very common. I find the same thing.
Yeah.
The personal project part of it, but the subjective well-being part of it.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to how you selected those particular scales, because I selected different ones, and not that either one's better. I just wanted, since you've been in the field longer, what was the thinking process of why you selected those ones versus like Riff's scale of multidimensional well-being?
We did think about Riff scale. There were a few, we wanted to make contact with sort of the most popular modes of assessment. So, you know, satisfaction with life scale was pretty straightforward to use measures like the PANIS of positive.
Yeah, so I use those. I'm using like Diener's 5-item
Yeah.
scale, the PANIS. But then when
We
you
s-
started to get into meaning and those other types of categories
Yep.
that define well-being,
We thought really the only reason that we didn't use Riff scale was that it's long, and
Okay.
we have a huge, you know, as you can sort of gather,
Yeah.
we have a huge amount of stuff that we're making people fill out at every time point, and we just didn't feel like we could additionally fit that in. But we chose a couple of these sort of shorter scales that were related to, you know, meaning and purpose, because, and actually I think that it was an accident that both of those got included. We were supposed to be picking one, and I think we had settled on one, and then like an RA just put them both in because they were both on the list at some point.
yeah.
But so we definitely wanted to make sure that we hit on these things that people in, you know, psychologists think about as eudaimonic, even though the philosophers, you know, as soon as I started mentioning this, she started yelling at me about it. It's like, that's not eudaimonia. But anyway, but I wanted to make contact with that area of the field, right? And so we just picked a couple of those that were relatively short, like that Flourishing Scale is nice partly because it's quite brief. You know, in like half a dozen items, it gets at how well you're doing in a bunch of different important areas of life. So really, brevity is my best answer there. So
Great.
if
Yeah.
you have the space, probably the Riff scale is better.
That's another learning experience I had. We can't find out exactly what we want to find out because we don't have enough time. That's not a typical
Philosophers
thing
are like,
that
I've been
we-
doing this for 2,000 years.
I know. Those students can't sit for another half hour.
I want to say how much I enjoyed your presentations first, but then I have a small point about your puzzlement at the fact that there doesn't seem to be much of an association between past success at personal projects and current subjective well-being. And it seems to me it depends upon which sense of success you're talking about, because one of your senses of success was completion of the project, right? Now, if a past project is successful because it's completed, I wouldn't be surprised at all that it doesn't connect or associate very well with a current sense of well-being. I mean, I finish a book and I get it published and I'm happy for a short time and then it's history. I mean, really,
Yeah.
it's just gone. And I'm now thinking about the next book. So if you say, how are you feeling today, Linda? I'm not going to say, oh, well, you know, I had this book published, you know. It just doesn't seem to have much of an effect. But that's because it's success in the sense of completion. There's nothing more to be done.
Right.
But you also had as a measure, or one of your senses of success was just progress, right? And I can see why that would be. So I guess I'm just, I'm puzzled about why you're puzzled that completing a project doesn't seem to connect very well to present sense of well-being.
I think this is where it's going to be crucial for us to actually delve into the specific content of the projects, and we simply haven't had the time to process the data to that level yet, because we're going to do qualitative coding of individual projects. If your project is to find a good romantic relationship, and you've completed that project, I'm guessing that will continue to contribute to your well-being, for example. So I think it really is going to depend on what type of project that we're talking about, and we have the data to actually get into that and sort of try to tease those things apart, and it'll just take longer.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question that just follows up on exactly what you just said, Colin, and it's whether or not you have a way to look at, for the projects people list, a difference between something like a joint project, a project I want to undertake with someone else, something that will be successful when it goes well with someone else, versus a more individually oriented project? And if so, if you had plans to look at if that might predict something uniquely.
Mm-hmm. That's a cool idea. I mean, that's the kind of thing we can definitely code for qualitatively. I can't remember off the top of my head if there are any of the standard questions about each project that really get into how much they rely on or interact with other people. There might be something in there, but I just don't remember right now.
Okay, let's thank our presenters.